How do you destroy an enemy army 3 times your size, entrenched in a deadly defensive line of their own choosing? In 1843, General Napier's answer was simple: firepower and ruthless discipline. When 6,000 British soldiers assaulted the natural trenches defended by 15,000 warriors, what happened wasn't just a battle, it was a flawless masterclass in modern artillery. In this video, we examine one of the British Army's most dangerous and least known victories, the Battle of Hyderabad. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Hyderabad. The engagement that completed the conquest of Sindh demonstrated the full reach of the East India Company's military machine and produced a moment of defiance that even the victors stopped to honour. But before we get to that dried plain outside Hyderabad, before we watch Napier's artillery tear apart a prepared defensive line and his infantry go in with the bayonet, we need to understand what brought both sides to this particular piece of ground, and why the resistance at Dubbo was not merely the last stand of a defeated dynasty, but something considerably more complicated than that. The context goes back further than Miani. It goes back to 1839 and one of the most catastrophic British military operations of the 19th century. The First Anglo-Afghan War had ended in disaster. An entire army destroyed during the retreat from Kabul. 16,000 soldiers and camp followers lost in the passes. The company's aura of invincibility shattered across the subcontinent. When Lord Ellenborough arrived as Governor-General in 1842, he was inheriting the wreckage of a strategy and a reputation that both urgently needed repair. Sindh sat at the northwest corner of British India, straddling the Indus River. It was ruled by the Talpur Amirs, a confederation of Baluch clan chiefs who had governed the region since the late 18th century. The Talpurs were not a unified state. They were a collection of separate principalities, each with its own court, its own army, and its own interests. This fragmentation had made them useful as a buffer zone between British India and the turbulent northwest. It also made them vulnerable in precisely the way that Ellenborough's policy required. Napier arrived in Sindh in 1842 with sweeping civil and military authority. He was 60 years old, a veteran of the Peninsular War, ambitious in a way that age had not diminished, and entirely clear-eyed about what he was being sent to do. The formal pretext for confrontation was a dispute over treaty obligations. The practical reality was that Sindh was going to become British territory, and Napier's job was to provide the military justification for that outcome. He went about it with a systematic efficiency that characterised everything he did. He occupied the desert fortress of Imamgarh without authorisation, applied pressure to the separate emirs in ways designed to fracture their already fragile unity, and waited for events to provide his opening. In February 1843, Baluch warriors attacked the British residency in Hyderabad. Napier had the pretext he needed. The Battle of Miani followed on February 17th. Against odds of roughly 10-1, Napier's force of under 3,000 men had driven a Talpur army from prepared positions along the Fuleli Canal, taken the city of Hyderabad, and accepted the surrender of several of the emirs. The casualties told the story of what modern artillery and disciplined volley fire could do against tribal warriors, armed with swords, shields, and outdated muskets. It was not a close contest, but it was not the end. One emir had refused to surrender. Mir Sher Muhammad Talpur, called Sher Sindh, the Lion of Sindh, had not been at Miani. He governed Mirpur, controlled resources the others did not, and had watched the defeat from a distance, with the particular cold clarity of a man who had not yet committed everything he had. While the other emirs negotiated their capitulation, Sher Muhammad was doing something different. He was gathering an army. In the 5 weeks between Miani and Dubbo, Mir Sher Muhammad assembled a force of between 15 and 20,000 men. Survivors from Miani, fresh levies from the clans, every fighting man the remaining Talpur leadership could put in the field. It was the last significant military force the emirs could raise, and everyone on both sides understood what its defeat would mean. Napier understood it too. He marched with approximately 6,000 troops: the 22nd Cheshire Regiment, the 25th Bombay Native Infantry, units of Bengal Cavalry, the Poona Irregular Horse, and the 1st Bombay Horse Artillery. The artillery was the key. At Miani, Napier had learned what his guns could do against mass formations in confined terrain. At Dubbo, he intended to apply that lesson at larger scale. The Baluch position was formidable. Mir Sher Muhammad's commanders had placed their men behind the system of dried nullahs, deep drainage channels cut into the Sindh plain by centuries of seasonal flooding, that ran across the Dubbo battlefield. These natural trenches provided cover from direct fire, channeled any attacking force into predictable approach routes, and gave defenders with edged weapons and short-range firearms exactly the close-quarters advantage that neutralised British superiority at distance. What the Baluch position could not neutralise was high-angle artillery fire. Napier opened the battle with his guns. The 1st Bombay Horse Artillery moved through the terrain with the kind of practised efficiency that separated the company's technical arms from anything the Talpurs could field, finding angles that dropped ordnance into the nullahs themselves, dismantling the defensive advantage that the ground had seemed to provide. The Baluch artillery responded, but the mismatch in training, equipment, and ammunition quality was decisive. British shells were landing on target. Baluch rounds were falling short or failing to detonate. The bombardment was not merely physical, it was also psychological. The particular demoralisation of being hit repeatedly from a range at which you cannot effectively respond. When Napier committed his infantry, the defensive structure had already been degraded in ways that a frontal assault alone could not have achieved. The 22nd Cheshire Regiment went forward with the bayonet. So did the Bombay sepoys alongside them. The fighting in and around the nullahs was close and intense. This was the kind of terrain where individual courage and physical determination mattered more than formation tactics, and the Baluch warriors gave everything they had. They were not fighting without skill or bravery. They were fighting without the industrial military infrastructure that the company had spent decades building, and the company's enemies had spent the same decades failing to match. Napier's cavalry completed the work. The Poona irregular horse and Bengal units swung around the Baluch flanks, cutting off the retreat routes toward the Indus. The combination of frontal infantry pressure and encircling cavalry left the Baluch formation with nowhere to go that offered safety. The battle lasted several hours. By its end, the last organised Talpur military force had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The British casualties were 39 dead and 231 wounded. Baluch casualties were several thousand. The arithmetic of industrial warfare against tribal resistance produced these ratios consistently across the 19th century, and the Battle of Hyderabad was no different from the pattern. What was different was what happened in the final phase of the fighting, at the moment when the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hosh Muhammad Shidi was Mir Sher Muhammad's senior commander. He was of Sidi origin, a community descended from East African migrants who had served the courts and armies of the Indian subcontinent for centuries, rising in some cases to positions of considerable military distinction. He had been with the Talpur cause through everything, through the preparations, through Miani, through the desperate weeks of reconstruction, and now through the collapse of the last army Sindh could field. When the Baluch formation began to break, when it became clear to any observer that the battle was lost and that continued resistance meant certain death, with no corresponding military advantage, Hosh Muhammad Shidi did not withdraw. He rallied the men around him. He called out in Saraiki, in the language of the people he was fighting for, words that became the most famous phrase to emerge from the entire Sindh campaign. The translation is approximate because some things resist clean conversion between languages, but the meaning is unambiguous. We will die, but we will not give up Sindh. He died where he stood fighting. Napier, who had seen a great deal of combat across a long career and was not a man given to easy sentiment, ordered full military honours for Hosh Muhammad Shidi. The body was buried with the ceremony accorded to a respected enemy, an acknowledgement that what had happened here was not simply the defeat of an obstacle, but the end of a man who had understood what he was doing and had chosen to do it anyway. The grave at Dubbo still exists. People go to it. The fall of Hyderabad completed the conquest of Sindh. Mir Sher Muhammad escaped across the border and spent years in exile, attempting to organise a return, eventually surrendering and spending the rest of his life as a pensioner of the company. The other emirs were transported. to the Andaman Islands, to Burma, to various comfortable forms of permanent removal from the political landscape of their own territory. The Talpur Confederation ceased to exist as a governing power. What replaced it was the administrative machinery of the East India Company, applied to a region that had not been governed by centralised bureaucracy before. Karachi was developed as a port. It would grow into one of the great cities of South Asia. The Indus was open to navigation. Survey teams mapped the territory with the thoroughness that the company applied everywhere it conquered. Napier governed Sindh until 1847, with the same energy and impatience he brought to everything. He fought persistently against the corruption that company administration generated wherever it operated, losing most of those fights. He went home with a fortune, a reputation, and a complicated legacy that his own writings documented with unusual candour. He had known what he was doing in Sindh. He had said so at the time. The Cheshire Regiment carried Miani and Hyderabad as battle honours. The Poona irregular horse were renamed and reorganised, their Baluch adversaries eventually becoming the model for the regiment's own insignia, one of the stranger tributes that military history records. The 1st Bombay Horse Artillery continued as one of the most effective technical units in the subcontinent. And in the Sindh countryside, the defeat at Dubbo did not end the resistance. It transformed it. For the next 100 years, a movement centred on the spiritual lineage of the Pir Pagaro, the Sufi leaders who had been the alternative authority in Sindh long before the company arrived, maintained an armed challenge to British rule in the rural interior. The Hers, as these fighters were called, operated from the forests and marshes, refusing incorporation into the colonial order that the battles of Miani and Hyderabad had established. They were not finally suppressed until the 1940s, and the suppression was not clean or easy, or something that reflects particularly well on anyone. The significance of Hyderabad extended beyond the immediate territory. Sindh gave the company control of the lower Indus Valley and a direct land approach to the northwest frontier, the corridor through which any serious threat to British India would eventually have to pass. The strategic logic that Ellenborough had identified was real, even if the methods used to act on it were not. Karachi's development into a major port transformed the commercial geography of the entire region. The Indus route to the Punjab and beyond became a functioning military and commercial artery, in a way it had never been under Talpur administration. For the soldiers who fought at Dubbo, the immediate consequences were more prosaic. Prize money was distributed, honours were gazetted. The 22nd Cheshire Regiment added battle honours that would be carried on their colours for generations. Napier wrote dispatches that gave full credit to his artillery commanders and the steady performance of the Bombay sepoy units alongside the British infantry, the kind of professional acknowledgement that the mixed composition armies of the company required if they were to function. The Battle of Hyderabad was one engagement in a larger pattern that repeated itself across the Victorian century. The application of disciplined artillery, trained infantry, and cavalry capable of cutting off retreat to the defeat of forces that fought with courage and local knowledge, but without the industrial military capacity that the company had assembled. The outcome at Dubbo was never seriously in doubt from the moment Napier's artillery found its range. What was not predictable was what happened in the final minutes, when a commander with nothing left to gain and everything to lose chose to make his position permanent. Hosh Muhammad Shidi was not fighting for a military outcome by the time he died. He was fighting for something that military outcomes cannot capture, and he chose words to describe it that outlasted the battle, and the Talpur Confederation, and the East India Company itself. We will die, but we will not give up Sindh, if this is the kind of history that holds your attention. The battles where the outcome was settled by discipline and technology, but the meaning was settled by something else entirely, then you know what to do. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the battles that shaped a nation, told the way they deserve.